So we are here with Peter Koppes of The Church.
Or Koppes.
Koppes, right? Is that a Greek name?
No. If it had an A, maybe Koppes might be Greek, because sometimes I've seen people misspell it, but I've seen it spelled with an EZ, which make you think it has a Spanish or something like that.
Yeah, I was kind of debating that.
A Dutchman told me it was definitely a southern Dutch name, but it could be anything, Portuguese, you never know. Those Europeans, you know what they're like.
They're crazy. Anyways, you are here promoting a record that came out 30 years ago. We are celebrating the 30 years of the Starfish. You want to show their album?
Yeah, and also the 20 years of Hologram of Baal, which was the album that I returned to the church after being away for 5 years. But this is the one that was the monument of success under Milky Way. A very, very popular album, this one.
So since you
Do
are...
yourself a favour and buy one of those.
You still can? Well, since you are celebrating the 30 years, I want to maybe concentrate on talking about that album.
Yeah.
So prior to even writing and recording Starfish, what kind of a following was the church enjoying in the United States and Australia?
It was bad enough for our record company in Australia to drop us, and the record company in America to drop us, and the publishing company, everyone dropped us. All we had left was a manager that we didn't like. And the head of Arista Records, who was like the most famous record exec in history, who used to run Columbia Records and then started his own label, Arista, which is the most successful label ever. He rang up our manager, or someone working for him, because he wanted us on their label, and said how much, and he offered us a very significant sum to make a record. And we did. And it was an interesting thing, because we'd done Heyday, the album previous to that, which was mostly co-written songs. The band had found its feet writing songs together, and it had orchestrations with orchestral instruments, strings and horns and that. It was like a monument of achievement for us as a band and sonically, and everyone dropped us. Funny enough, when we had a great success with the Starfish album, which was like us really confident writing songs together and a distillation of pretty simple arrangements without adding, on Heyday we added horns and strings because our guitar work seems to work together and creates these harmonic effects, illusions if you like, of other instruments. So we used to add the instruments that we heard, but on Starfish we didn't need to. We thought not to, and it's a very sparse record, but it is really we did arrive, and it's sad to think that we might never have had that opportunity to make that record our most successful record, if and that might have been the end of our career.
Yeah?
Yeah, well, we were very lucky to be signed up by Arista, and then when Arista made the record, they sold it to an Australian label. It went gold in America before it went gold in Australia.
Interesting. I mean, that's something a lot of people don't know and don't even think about. So how would you describe the writing process for the Starfish album?
Well, it is a style of music that right from the beginning, using our successful singles as we've always been an album band, but
true.
Thinking of the singles particularly that people might identify with, the Unguarded Moment was, if you hear the introduction to that, you can hear they're called in musical terms rolling arpeggios, when you play a chord separating the notes and pluck them individually. And between the two rolling arpeggios, I had this trick that I used to construct these things. Was something I liked, which I've since, or just recently realised it was because I'd heard in school singing of choirs or a classroom of just young kids, usually that would go, Michael row the boat ashore, and the next person goes, Michael row the boat ashore, and then you get this whole thing called a canon or a round, where everyone's sort of singing different words of the same song. And I realised this year that's what I've been trying to recreate all this time, as well as the sound of the church, ironically, or maybe not so ironically, was the sound of church organs. And my first interest in music was the organ, and I couldn't afford to own one, so I learnt to play drums, and then I learnt to play guitar, and then I tried to play the guitar like a Hammond organ. My approach to guitar is where I can play open strings like keyboard players do. So it's a mechanical thing, and the style that I've identified and understand now what I've been trying to do. And now the band you'll hear is pretty much like Baroque harmony. That's the first classical, well not classical, first orchestral format.
Now, when you were writing this record, did you have any indication that you onto something special?
Well, no, I think we felt that we were maturing with our songwriting style, if you like, to distill it to that essential thing, because we play it every night now, and we're hearing it and analysing it and reflecting on it to know it was essential. There's no notes that were wasted. Everything that you hear was like a real distillation at the essential notes for each of those songs, and it was really, because it was studied, we recorded it for 3.5 months, rehearsed it for a couple of weeks, and then recorded it for 3 months. So it was really studied and perfected with the producers in LA.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question. It was the first time you recorded outside of Australia. What was that experience like?
Well, we'd actually written the songs outside Australia. A lot of them have been written in different places. In America, I remember Antenna was written in America, Reptile was written in Australia. But it was a big studio. I suppose we took ourselves, we were with the biggest company in Australia before that, recording in their home studio, which is the best studio in Australia on our other albums leading up to that. So that we weren't intimidated by being in a really big studio in America. But what was interesting was it was a brand new studio in America financed by Japanese interests, and they bought this Synclavier, which was a music computer, a huge one. Before that you had a Fairlight, which was the Australian invention of a music computer. They had this thing called a Synclavier, which was the new thing. And because we were rehearsing the songs, and Under the Milky Way was an acoustic song, we didn't rehearse that. And so they gave it to and we didn't treat it very seriously, because all the other stuff was kind of co-written, apart from one song and the songs that Marty and I wrote. And so we didn't really consider Under the Milky Way as part of the record. They gave it to the guy who was monitoring this machine, who was the expert specialist for this computer, because it does take a hell of a lot of specialisation to operate it. And so he built up the track with all the sequences and the sounds and things like that, and consulted with Steve a bit, and then they built this track. And then at the end of the recording, they said, "Oh, you have to play some guitar on this track, Under the Milky Way." And we said, "Oh yeah, what the hell?" So we did, and then the next thing you know, the record company has listened to the album. They said, "That's the single," and we thought, well, okay, it's a novelty, but all of our singles have been novelties compared to what we do as an album, but that one more so than anything, really.
It's funny you say that. It's not the first time I come across a band that I talk to where their biggest song is almost like a throwaway song to them. Yet
that Smells Like Teen Spirit changed the world. That launched grunge to the world, and that was 2 flukes of that was they were one song short. Nirvana was one song short of an album, so they just copied More Than a Feeling by Boston, and it's just the same trick as a Wild Thing, very simple, and just threw it together in one day.
It's funny what you can accomplish in a spare of a moment.
Yeah, but the other thing that happened there was, in that same week that they launched that album, or in that month that they launched that album, they changed the system of charting in America so that singles could chart depending on how much airplay they were getting. That helped their chart position. Okay. But the album that the singles came from had previously been getting advantage of the airplay as giving them chart positions, but they said that's not fair, because some albums like country and grunge albums weren't getting airplay by radio, and so it was a disadvantage then to have the albums listed depending on their airplay. And so the month that happened, Nirvana went to number 2 and Garth Brooks went to number 1.
And nobody knew who Garth Brooks was.
Everyone realised that country artists were selling everybody albums, and grunge was such a significant thing. All the record companies signed every band in Seattle, and Seattle was built on, apart from a few other industries, I'm pretty sure Seattle was built on grunge.
Correct.
city.
Now the album was produced by Greg Ladanyi and
Ladanyi,
Weddy
yeah.
Wachtel.
And what he would tell, what he would tell was a session guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's a really unique guy because he's kind of a Jewish rock and roll kind of guy who almost joined the Rolling Stones, and he was one of the best friends of Keith Richards. In fact, during the middle of Starfish, Keith Richards was making a solo album in Toronto, and Waddy Wachtel had to leave for 2 weeks, and he said, you would leave too if Keith Richards asked you to go and make a solo
Correct.
album with him. And we said, yeah, sure. So he went away for 2 weeks, and he helped actually produce Keith Richards. So he's a session guy, one of the top. He was on Betty Davis Eyes and White Winged Dove, you know, that's him on White Winged Dove with Stevie, and he's Stevie Nicks' to this day live guitar player. And so he's, you know, you think of him as like embedded in the LA session music scene, which everyone has images of that might be really conservative, but they're completely wrong on that level, but also on the level of before that, well, the band, the Wrecking Crew, was like Glenn Campbell and all these session musicians,
Yeah.
Jazz musicians who played on the Monkees and played on just about everything recorded in LA. So this LA session musician and producer thing, you know, is I don't know what concept people have about that. I don't know if Steve said certain things about it, but we were Greg Ladanyi produced Boys of Summer by Don
Fantastic
Henley
track.
and Mike
Timeless.
Hale.
Timeless.
And that's, I've always looked for the magic in working with anyone. I always have to have like-mindedness. Otherwise, I'm very suspicious. I won't work with someone I know that I'm going to have a problem with. And that Boys of Summer was such an exemplary.
It is. It's one of those songs to this day. It makes the time stand still when
so
you hear that
that's
sound.
why I thought I'll be happy to work with him. And Waddy Wachtel, of course, had those other credentials of, you know, session, and you know, he lent us his.
He's got Keith approval.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, he was fun to be around as well. Greg was a pretty straight up guy, and they were both having issues with things that kept them awake all night, but I thought it was pretty productive. I got what I wanted out of it, and I think they did too, actually.
So why the title Starfish?
Richard Plug, the drummer, said Starfish for some reason, because he's a very organic, he's part Indonesian native in his indigenous, he's like got an indigenous part of him, his personality, and so he kind of responds to organic things a lot, and he said Starfish, and I said, oh, let's call it Starfish and Peans, or Peans, which are like anthems, you know, Starfish and Peans. And they thought that was completely pretentious, because it probably was, so we just called it Starfish. And then the record company asked the same question, say, why was it Starfish? And Steve says that I was asked why the lyrics about my song were quizzed very seriously, my song A New Season, and I just gave the examples of the metaphors that I was, and the reasons for the metaphors that I was using for A New Season, which was like hope and all the rest of it. So Steve just wrote a long-winded explanation of Starfish, and they didn't want to tamper with it, so they just they let him use it.
Once the album came out, how supportive was Arista?
How supportive?
Yeah.
Totally. Oh, they're not like see, that's another thing, a misnomer, that America and American record companies, big record companies, have this disrespect as if they're just factories of that. But the reason Clive Davis, the head of Arista Records, was so successful is because he knew about music and he knew about great artists. Like with Arista, he had Bob Dylan signed to Columbia Records, despite the fact that he was not selling records. He knew that, but he wouldn't let him go. He just, or the guy that was part of representing the A&R section with Bob Dylan wasn't told to let him go. So when Arista started, they've had Patti Smith on there, they've had Lou Reed, they've had Iggy Pop, but they had Whitney Houston, of course, filling the bank accounts. And then I think she's probably the biggest one at that time. But then he brought Carlos Santana out of retirement, so you should just get, he's on a guitarist, don't you? You should just do, duets with fucking singers. And everyone realised how, I'm not particularly big on the record. I love Santana on that, but I was really, really glad that he was given another breath of, life.
Now, once the album came out, the single Under the Milky Way quickly became an MTV staple.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by the success and the amount of exposure
Not
the song
really.
got?
No, because we are a rock band, and I thought when we were making Starfish, we were watching MTV, and there's all of these hair bands, these rock spectacular bands who made spectacular looking videos with explosions and lots of sexy girls, and I could see why it was popular. But I knew that the music didn't have any longevity in it, and we've always maintained as musicians we want to be musicians, and if we can for the rest of our lives, we would love to do that and explore the art, and in the way a band like Pink Floyd should have, who didn't, because unfortunately, but we always were musicians and album makers and a musicians band. So as much as we thought it's a shame that more people don't share in our music, we knew Under the Milky Way is a very special song, because popular music doesn't have to be bad. It's really great when a really popular song is a good song, and I thought it was not enormously popular, but we sold gold, we didn't sell platinum on the basis of that, so it's not as popular as you think. In fact, the record cost $500,000 to make, and that's how much money we made. So there was no money made by that record, and we still owe Arista Records over $500,000 for the 4 albums that we made with them.
Interesting.
Another misnomer. They reckon record companies exploit artists, but they don't necessarily.
How much touring was done for this album
A lot.
initially?
That's half of the money, but we spent $250,000 making the record, $150,000 on videos, and $100,000 on tour support. Of course, we have to pay all that back.
I was about to ask you how your lives had changed after that success, but I think you almost answered that.
Well, I don't know. What the good thing was that we wrote, Marty and I wrote songs for that album. So the money that was made by the songwriting component, because we all wrote the songs, or we wrote individual songs. We made money from the songwriting, so it's not as if we were broke as a result of it, because the songwriters make 4 times as much as what the record makes anyway. So we all did quite well out of that, and afforded us to keep going a bit longer as a band.
Now that you are playing the album in its entirety, how are you reflecting back? Are you finding anything new playing it 30 years later that you didn't feel before?
Yeah. Well, it's a nice thing to think that that it's not just a nostalgic fondness that people go and see these nostalgia acts and only want to hear the old songs and have this nostalgic experience, which might be good or bad, thinking like they prefer to remember it as it was, because it's not, sometimes music doesn't really age well.
True, but in case of Starfish, what do you feel? Do you feel it aged well?
It's definitely what it's giving, because we do the Starfish set and then we do our new, or a mixture of older and newer songs, particularly seemingly psychedelic ones, or the Starfish album seems to, you start seeing the elements in the other things from the second set, and then you forget very quickly about Starfish, and I think the audiences are kind of like taken away on our expedition into the power of music, immersion, that intoxicating immersion that music should be, and so because they're having a nostalgic experience with Starfish, which isn't an album that you immerse yourself in, but they get totally taken into the cosmos with the later stuff, especially the last album, this particular album here.
Which we'll get to in a second.
It's got 2 of the most psychedelic songs of our career on there, particularly, and interestingly, they're both singles, and maybe not so interestingly, when you think that I Am the Walrus is probably one of the best, and Strawberry Fields are 2 of the best Beatles songs ever, and pretty much if you like those, you should get this album, because you might find something very similar there without us being that. But we're definitely acolytes of John Lennon and that Beatles phenomenon, which people think was just because of the screaming girls and all the rest of it. It was actually a scientific thing, that they were quite different than any other band musically that came before them or after them, pretty much, except for maybe Bowie and Kurt Cobain, Tom York, and us.
Once you became successful back in 1988 with Starfish, was there a lot of pressure on the band with a follow-up?
We never let that ever affect us. And we've never had writer's block, and we've been accused of being our own worst enemies by not capitulating to record company pressure to say, they say, why don't you write another song like that? And they don't, obviously. The reason they're in an office and not musicians or artists, because it is very much an artist's realm that we operate in any great, musicians and artists operating in a realm of their own making to court inspiration and fertility of ideas, and as soon as you start looking at money, because that's all they're looking at, and success, and we like money. We're very lucky we have like a benefactor or two benefactors who have for 15 years or more now, probably 20 years almost, have supplied us money to make the records, and so it has. We're fortunate on that level. Otherwise, we wouldn't be around either.
Well, which helps. Thanks to them.
No, it is critical. Without them, there wouldn't be any records, probably. Although we made the Reformation album, which was the album that Steve, Tim and I made after Magician Amongst the Spirits, when Marty wouldn't let me return to the church because he thought that he might like some money from a record company advance and not share it with me, which is the true story that maybe the first time we got on camera here. And so we made a record without him, and the Reformation record, but because it wasn't branded the church, no one released it. I put it out on my label with a company in Australia who was a friend of mine who's now done very well as an independent distributor as well. We were actually, all our records come out through him and in his label in Australia, or distribution label. But so we made the Reformation, and that was it was a studio project that developed a new direction for the church. And then we thought, well, that wasn't very successful, so we invited Marty to come and play with the band to try and raise some money to make an album. And we did that on a shoestring budget. It was like really, really difficult to make that. Had a lot of friends and favours, and the Australian government unemployment money went into us being able to do that, because Marty and Steve took off, and Tim and I had to finish that record, with favours and our own time.
Another aspect of you playing Starfish live is originally you played out with Marty. Now you have Ian playing on the side. How does he interpret that music?
Ian's more of a guitarist in my style of guitar playing. So Marty was a very clean 12-string kind of guitar player, whereas I'm more of a distorted rock kind of player, and Ian is kind of probably more like me, so he has to try and impersonate Marty when he does those songs. But interestingly, on these two albums, which I regard as two of the best albums of all time by any band, that when Ian joined the band, we did this one and this one, I like these records better than any of the other records we've made, because Ian sounds more like me, and it's like having two of me, making the record. But maybe that's personal taste.
True. Now, because Under the Milky Way was the only big hit you had, you are often being placed as a one-hit wonder. Which we agree with that assumption.
We don't compare ourselves to popularity at all. We notice the benefits that big bands, like last night Metallica was playing this big stadium right next to us, and we could hardly fill this big hall that we're at, and we watched all the people leaving that entertainment centre, and they were all, you know, excited and you know, from the experience of seeing Metallica and that, and I didn't have any regret whatsoever that I was in my band playing my music and they were doing that kind of music. I thought, you know, whatever. I'm very, very happy with the fact that we've been able to play. I'd rather play small venues and see people who you know and not just there because they think that's what they're supposed to go to because it's popular. These are people, like, and we do meet and greets with people before shows if they, you know, want to know who we are. We talk to them and find out what kind of people they are, and do a bit of market research, and it's really fulfilling. For whatever you think music's supposed to be, and as artists we want to amuse ourselves probably initially, but if other people get in on that, we're really, really impressed by that, and we know it's a pretty exclusive thing. So I would not say I have any envy for any of those big bands, who, especially Pink Floyd, who have so much money they don't have to work together.
Yeah.
You know, and they shouldn't make records separately anyway, because they should admit that they're just better if Roger Waters and Dave Gilmour were together. They'd probably make a really great record. But I can see when you've got plenty of money and you've got your comfort zone, you don't really care. But then it's a shame for the sacrifice of your art. So I feel blessed that we have, you know, especially with Ian joining the band, because we had conflict in our band before, and we've actually grown better. And the church is a unique entity, and a legacy that people will maybe look at this whole era of music from the rock and roll era to now and say, well, what is success? You know, who is still making good records, you know, at the end?
At the same time, to me, it's like the biggest misconception of the church, because how can you lump the band with One Hit Wonder and not realize that you have 25 releases?
Yeah.
Right?
But you do need the hit to afford it at all. We wouldn't have had the attention of our patrons if we hadn't have had that hit. So everything that's happened is quite acceptable, and it's an interesting journey, and the journey's, you know, been a lot of fun.
Now, a few years back, Starfish was re-released as a double CD with additional bonus tracks.
Yeah.
Are you planning on something special to celebrate the 30th anniversary as far as releases go, or this is it?
Yeah, they did a vinyl version in Australia for the meet and greet people, and there was a guy in Australia who was going to do a double vinyl with the bonus tracks of the original reissue, because those bonus tracks were on a reissue. They were outtakes from the recordings. Interestingly, they were the ones that Clive Davis, a lot of those songs on the bonus tracks were the ones that Clive Davis wanted on the album, and we chose to, they were the demos, and we chose not to record those. So maybe we might have had a much bigger success if we had recorded the songs that he initially thought were better ones for the album, but that's, you know, who's to know. But the bonus tracks, you know, certainly are not just songs that weren't good enough to be on the album. They should have been on the album as far as the head of the record company goes, some of them.
Okay, so we spoke extensively about Starfish because of this tour. But the church is a very forward-thinking band. You're still releasing new music. How would you describe the latest two albums? I brought two of them because they are related.
Yeah.
They are related, and so you cannot
albums
speak about one without mentioning the other.
And that's significant when you realise they both have a style. Half of each of those albums are the most complex and yet accessible sounding music that you will hear from any band today. These albums belong in this millennium, whereas I don't know many bands that kind of sound like they belong in the 21st century. They all sound like 20th century. Is that sound like a cliche? Does it sound arrogant?
No,
I'm
no,
trying to
it's
explain.
Mhm.
I actually have a science. I know
It
the
sounds
science
good
of-
because when I listen to these records, there's nothing else out there that sounds like it.
Mhm.
And
Well,
and
that's- I'm gonna
I don't want
explain
to.
why. There's
I
a
have
science.
no band to compare it to.
Yeah. Well, Radiohead is the only band that I know that makes records for this new millennium, because Tom York is a genius, and I know I teach guitar and study harmony and teach musical theory in the modern form, and I know that there's no books. In fact, I'm writing a manual for guitar players to be able to identify harmonisation, or accompaniment and solos in the modern idiom, which is a very, very grey area of the rule book, that there isn't a rule book has been written. That's how grey it is, and it's kind of because of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. What they've done is it's a scientific, a physics aspect to what they did. It's an accidental, naive thing that they were just trying to write music that was a little bit refreshing for them, without realising that they stumbled into a very complex field that music harmony books still haven't been able to identify. They always use traditional theory to explain music theory, and I've got a system that simplifies using the guitar, especially the guitar, because it has a capacity with capos and things. That means that you can just identify 4 or 5 frets and all the patterns within there, and you just move it up and down to be in any chord or any key change, because music moves in. It's like a house with different rooms, and there's lots of different houses, and they jump between them all, and the way the Beatles did that was very significant, and it doesn't seem obvious that it's as complicated as it is. People like Jimmy Page and Ritchie Blackmore, who were obviously the guitarists in the biggest hard rock bands of all time, they were session musicians in London.
True.
On the records that other bands wrote songs like the Beatles and couldn't finish them. So they had to call those guys who obviously played classical guitar and done music theory and understood how the theory was broken for this system. Otherwise they could have got jazz musicians to do it. Same thing in LA, they had jazz session musicians who refused to play in rock and roll. And it might be a snobby thing, but then they had another group of musicians that were country musicians and jazz musicians, including Glenn Campbell, who were very, very sophisticated in theory, who played on all the Monkees records, Pet
Oh yeah,
Sounds,
he was the member of the Wrecking Crew for a while.
That's right. So the Wrecking Crew has only become known, there's a film about it, only become known, the girl, the bass player, she used to be
Carol,
a jazz, Carol Kay used to be a jazz guitarist in Massachusetts. She was playing bass, and there's a science, there's a physics there. That they had to be really, really smart people to be able to harmonise these songs. And of course, the Beatles, they wrote songs like that, but they couldn't harmonise themselves either. So George Martin had a degree in music, so he just did orchestral arrangements of those songs, because he knew what the theory was and knew when he could use his theory, or probably maybe even how to bend it, because he could tell he wasn't a stickler for tradition, because he was doing all these wild, crazy tapes. And the irony there is that the label Parlophone, meaning speech, Parlo, was a comedy label, and so they chucked the Beatles in with this guy on the comedy label who had a degree in music, and boom, the Beatles there with this.
It was a perfect chemical reaction.
Yeah, it was because they were open-minded people and not stuck in their ways, which is what the nature of music and art and humanity's evolution and consciousness is all supposed to be growing.
Yeah.
And seriously, the science of music, since sadly John Lennon isn't here, and I know it sounds very arrogant to make any comparison, that between Tom York, who's got some brilliant musicians in Radiohead, of course, it springs from the songwriting pretty much primarily, though, that takes you out in places that these albums and Radiohead go.
So, finally, what's next for you and the church?
Well, I've done 5 solo albums. The last solo album I did was 15 years ago, and because I played piano and guitar, a lot of my solo stuff is generated on a piano, which is what changed the Beatles as well when they started doing Hey Jude and I'm the Walrus. Those songs are written on piano, and that changes, that exploded in music when the Beatles did that, and that's when everyone was like left behind, I reckon, except for Burt Bacharach and piano players, and of course Brian Wilson's a piano player, of course, Pet Sounds, you can see he wrote a lot of stuff on piano. Piano has been very significant. So Pride Before a Fall is a song that I kind of had contributed to with piano, and for me that's a cross between John Lennon and David Bowie.
Mm-hmm.
David Bowie wrote Life on Mars on piano, and you can tell from the song, I could tell he didn't write that on a guitar. There's some songs you can't, he wouldn't write on a guitar, but once you do write songs on piano like that, you start writing songs on guitar differently as well, because you understand the relationship of the left hand, which is bass, and the right hand, which is chords, and you can mash them together in a way that you can do it on guitar too. It's a lot easier on piano. And so I would like to do another solo record, especially an acoustic one, because my last solo record is probably it's more complex than what the Church is doing actually. Mm-hmm. But the Church has got another element that I enjoy, otherwise I wouldn't bother being involved with the Church either. So they're quite different. But my album that's 15 years old, Simple Intent, is as fresh now as it was then, because it's not like anything else. And yet, so I'd like to just do an acoustic album. That's what I'd like to do in the future. And write a book.
A book about?
About my experiences as a musician in bands and musically. After I've written my guitar scales theory manual, which is pretty ready to be released, I'd say next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.